We have a few people still popping up into the waiting room. I'll let them in as they're coming in, but we can go ahead and get started. So welcome to How to Write a Case Note with Professor Peter Knapp, who was one of my personal favorites. I will be honest, he was my favorite. Like, but so very excited to have this opportunity with Professor Knapp. As we're going through, or as he's going through, if you have any questions, just drop the question into the chat, and I'll I hate to say interrupt. Yeah, I'm going to interrupt Professor Knapp, but he's been so kind to help us out with this and guide everyone through how to write a case note. From personal experience, this was invaluable to me writing the case note last year. I would have been completely lost, and so I attribute a large portion of my just even being on the law review, much less success in law review, to Professor Knapp. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Professor Knapp.
Well, thank you much, Stephen. I think you're probably too kind, but I'm happy to be here and happy to talk with this group of people. I mean, who would I rather spend time with than a group of people who, having finished a semester of law school, say, you know, what I'm really interested in is another big helping of law. You are my people. We're going to talk about how to write a case note tonight. But rather than talking about it in the abstract, what I will do is talk about it in the context of writing a case note with a case that until 2 days ago, I had never read and was not familiar with. And I want to do that so that we move out of the realm of the abstract. So we'll talk about what the parts of the case note are and talk about how to handle them. But I want to do it in the context of being in the position of someone who'd actually have to write a case note about a case that's unfamiliar. And I picked for a case a recent United States Supreme Court decision, Bittner versus the United States, that is not only a case that I was completely unfamiliar with, but a case that covered an area of law, I will confess, like Bittner and Boyd, two of the individual parties, an area of law I was completely unfamiliar with, because it involves the Bank Secrecy Act. I suppose if you'd quizzed me, I would have guessed that there was a federal statute that was something like the Bank Secrecy Act, but I'd never heard of it, had no interest in it whatsoever, and mercifully, unlike Boyd and Bittner, had never run afoul of it. It's a relatively short United States Supreme Court opinion. If you print it out in Westlaw, it runs out to about 16, 17 pages. And the opinions are written by two snappy writers on the Supreme Court, Justices Gorsuch and Barrett. Like every single case, it contains a couple different stories, a factual story and a procedural story. And this case, indeed, contains two factual stories. One of them is about Jane Boyd. She is an American citizen. She had bank accounts in the United Kingdom. And when her father, who was a British citizen, died, her inheritance dramatically increased the amounts in those bank accounts because she deposited the proceeds from her inheritance in those UK bank accounts, and they rose to such a level that it triggered the Bank Secrecy Act. The other person that is involved in this case, and the name person on the case, is Alexandru Bittner, and his situation was considerably different. He was a dual US and Romanian citizen, and as Justice Gorsuch writes the lead opinion in the case, explains, he had come to America and worked as a dishwasher and a plumber and become a citizen of the United States through naturalization. But after the fall of communism, he moves back to Romania and starts a business that becomes very successful. And he deposits the money he makes from those businesses in bank accounts in Romania and other places in Europe, probably completely unaware that because he's still a dual citizen, the United States government is interested in those bank accounts and deposits he's made. Both of our defendants, they actually aren't criminal defendants, they end up with civil penalties, but both Boyd and Bittner failed to file a form that, for reasons I can't completely explain, is commonly known as the FBAR form. What does that stand for? Well, you might think it stands for something that is FBAR, but in fact, those are the reports for bank and financial accounts. So the acronym doesn't seem to fit completely or exactly. They were supposed to because they held certain sums in these foreign bank accounts. They didn't, and the federal government catches wind of that and tells them, you've got some filings you need to make. And that starts the procedural story that is also part of the case. Government contended that both Boyd and Bittner had committed non-willful violations of the Bank Secrecy Act, and they were subject to a $10,000 penalty for each account they'd failed to report. Well, both of them had corrected their errors. Both of them had hired accountants who got them straight with the law. But the government was seeking civil penalties for what it termed non-willful violations of $10,000 for each account. Boyd and Bittner hired lawyers. Their lawyers took very different positions. They each argued that they were subject to a penalty for each FBAR, each of the forms they'd failed to file, but not for each account that they had failed to report. Boyd was in the Ninth Circuit. There was a trial. The district court sided with the government, and the Ninth Circuit said, no, we're going to reverse. This position that the government is taking doesn't make sense to us. Boyd is subject to a fine for each account she failed to report. For Bittner, things turned out a little bit differently. The district court in the Fifth Circuit sided with him, but then the Ninth Circuit reversed and took the government's position. You owe a fine for each of the accounts in question. And in Bittner's case in particular, that was a whole lot of money because there were over 200 bank accounts that had not been reported during the reporting years he was supposed to report. Well, what do we have? We've got that thing that the Supreme Court and authors of moot court problems love. We've got a circuit split. And so the case ends up in front of the United States Supreme Court. And this case, like every case, like the cases that you're writing about, have both of those kinds of stories. A factual story about what happened to the parties to bring them in contact with the law, and a procedural story that leads up to the opinion that you'll be asked to write about. Well, this case results in a Supreme Court decision where Justice Gorsuch delivers the opinion of the court. And the lineups for the case are a little bit different than what you would think they would be if all you listen to is TV political news about our Supreme Court. Because Justice Gorsuch is joined in whole in his opinion by Justice Jackson, and in part by Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Alito, and Justice Kavanaugh. And the holding of the court is that there is one penalty per form that is not filed. Good news for both Boyd and Bittner, who see the amounts of fines that they're now subject to much more manageable number. Justice Barrett dissents. And who's she joined by? Well, something that may be something of a surprise if you're just looking at who appointed these justices: Justice Thomas, Justice Sotomayor, and Justice Kagan. And so that's our case. And that's the case that we're going to use to think through how we'd write a case note if this was the opinion that we had to write about. And so we start logically by thinking about what the structure of a case note actually is. There are basically 5 pieces. There's an introduction, there is a history, there is a case description, there is, most importantly, also analysis and some conclusion. And I want to talk about each of those pieces in turn. And in this opinion, as you might imagine, the big issue is one of statutory interpretation. As Justice Gorsuch explains at the first part of his opinion, the only question is whether or not failure to file an annual report is a single violation, or whether each account not included in the annual report triggers a separate civil fine of $10,000. Justice Gorsuch, in his opinion, says, let's look at the statute. It's 31 USC 5314, which is the part that triggers the obligation, and 5321, which is the part that covers civil violations of the statute, non-willful violations of the statute, I should say. And what Justice Gorsuch says in summary is this portion of the statute doesn't refer to accounts. It's true that another part of the statute does, but if we take a look at one of our common tools of statutory interpretation, expressio unius est exclusio alterius, fancy Latin for saying the expression of one thing excludes the other, it looks like Congress chose not to assess a non-willful penalty of $10,000 for each account. And looking at other contextual clues from federal regulations and notices, that suggests there's a single violation for each report, and that's in line with the drafting history. Justice Barrett's dissent, in a nutshell, of course, disagrees. The text indicates that the reporting requirement attaches to accounts, and inferences to violations are account, and references to account to violations are account specific. Federal regulations distinguish between the form used to report accounts and the accounts themselves, and that gives rise to the position of the dissent. And looming above all of this are some bigger questions, as you might suspect. What's the purpose of this statute? Why do we have it in the first place? And for Justice Gorsuch, at least, a fundamental principle of lenity. That's the stuff that's going to have to fill up our case note. We're going to have to talk about that stuff using each of these 5 parts. So, the case note. We start with the introduction. It's pretty specific, isn't it? It's pretty self-evident. What could possibly go wrong? Well, the one piece of advice I would give you about introduction is this. Make sure that it matches up with your conclusion. There is sometimes a tendency to oversell in introductions. If you avoid tabloid headlines like conservative bloc shattered in Bittner versus the United States, or Sotomayor and Kagan form new alliance with Barrett and Thomas, you're going to have a more sensible introduction, but it's also be an introduction that has some teeth in it. You don't want an introduction that really doesn't lead the reader ultimately to the point of the conclusion. Fairly straightforward piece. History. Well, there isn't, as it turns out, a whole lot of case history that you're going to have to write about. You've got the procedure here. You'll want to flag the fact that there is a circuit split. You certainly want to be attentive to both the Fifth and Ninth Circuit opinions. But a lot of this case is going to revolve around statutory interpretation. So part of your history may also include, as Justice Gorsuch sets out in his opinion, some of the drafting history and development of this particular statute. If you're writing about a different kind of case, one, for example, that reverses longstanding precedent, you may end up writing a case that focuses more intently on the pre-existing precedent that has been reversed. If you write about a case that takes the law in a new area, but makes use of existing precedent, your focus is probably going to be on the most important parts of that pre-existing precedent. What you're trying to do is give the reader some context, some legal context for this opinion that you're going to be writing about. Case description. Well, you're going to need to make some decisions. You're going to write a case description, and it is going to be thorough, and it is going to be complete, but it is going to be a lot shorter than the decision itself, even if the decision is relatively brief, like Bittner versus the United States. As you move through the decision that you're writing about, the opinion that you're writing about, you're going to need to think about what needs to be highlighted, what's interesting, what's valuable contribution to the development of the law, what's controversial. You're going to need to think about the central portions of law and fact that support the holding. And you may want to be attentive to the differences in factual description, if there's a dissent, between the lead opinion and the dissenting opinion. Here's the story Justice Gorsuch tells about Alexander Bittner. He's an American citizen, and he held as much as $16 million across more than 50 bank accounts in Romania, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. Oh, this is Barrett's description. Let me go back. Here's Alexander Bittner from the point of view of Justice Gorsuch and the majority. Born and raised in Romania, Mr. Bittner immigrated to the United States at a young age in 1982. He worked first as a dishwasher and later as a plumber, and along the way became a naturalized citizen. After the fall of communism, Mr. Bittner returned to Romania in 1990, where he launched a successful business career. Like many dual citizens, he did not appreciate that the United States law required him to keep the government apprised of his overseas financial accounts, even while he lived abroad. Shortly after returning to the United States in 2011, Mr. Bittner learned of his reporting obligations and engaged an accountant to help him prepare the required reports, covering 5 years from 2007 through 2011. Very different picture from that one that Justice Barrett gives us in the dissent. Alexander Bittner, an American citizen, held as much as $16 million across more than 50 bank accounts in Romania, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. He acknowledges that the Bank Secrecy Act and its implementing regulations required him to report his interest in these accounts to the federal government annually. Bittner also admits that he failed to comply with that requirement for 5 consecutive years. Well, what are you to do faced with those kinds of differing stories? If your obligation is to write the case note, you need to be cognizant of them both. And you need to respect and be attentive to the unsurprising fact that the factual story that is told in each opinion, be it the majority opinion or the dissent, is going to be a story that is meant to fit the facts with the ultimate proffered holding for each of those opinions. Justice Gorsuch tells a story about a hardworking immigrant who enjoys success in his native country when he moves back there, because that is a story that helps justify the wisdom of the ultimate holding he and the majority reach. Justice Barrett tells a very different story because hers is designed to support her position and the position of the dissent. Your job is to report on the case thoughtfully and contextually, and for purposes of your case description, attentive to both the facts that are helpful and harmful to the majority opinion or the dissent. The hard work and the most important work of the case note is the analysis. And you may say to yourself, well, I've never really written a case note before, so what do I know about the kind of analysis that's going to be necessary? My advice to you is draw on your experience from the legal writing that you have done. And you all have done some of that. You're going to need to think through what it is that makes this case tick. What is it that the authors of the opinions are using to justify and explain the result they would have the court reach? And here, we've got a case that involves some statutory interpretation. And chances are real good that you have spent a fair amount of time reading statutory interpretation and also probably doing some. So what we find when we go through this opinion may cover new areas of the law and language we've never seen before, but the trope of analysis will probably sound kind of familiar. It did to me when I started reading through this decision. Gorsuch says the law does not speak of accounts or their number. The one place the law does tailor penalties to accounts, it does so for willful violations. And that's not what we have here. And because Congress explicitly authorized per account penalties for some willful violations, the government asks us to infer that Congress meant to do so for non-willful violations as well. But for Justice Gorsuch and the rest of the majority, that argument doesn't hold water. In truth, he writes, this line of reasoning cuts against the government. When Congress includes particular language in one section of statute, but omits it from a neighbor, we normally understand that the difference in language to convey is a difference in meaning. That's the expressio unius argument that we mentioned earlier. That's a pretty straightforward textual reading. What makes this case interesting and a little bit more complicated is Justice Barrett, equally attentive to the language of the text, comes up with a different result. Identical words used in different parts of the same statute are generally presumed to have the same meaning. And I will tell you, and this happens to me after having read thousands and thousands of cases, as I'm reading through Justice Gorsuch's majority opinion, I'm kind of thinking, well, yeah, that makes sense. This seems like a pretty good argument. He's convincing me. As I flip to the dissent and start reading Justice Barrett, I say to myself, well, hold on now. This textual argument makes sense as well. And that should be no surprise. It is a 5-4 split case. And so reasonable minds, and it turns out reasonable minds of different legal castes can disagree and come to the exact opposite conclusion. That's the textual analysis. Things get even more, I would say, split and difficult to decide as we move out into some of the other tropes of analysis that you might expect to find. One of them here is there other stuff we can look at to find whether or not there is some guidance about what these words mean in the context of this particular statute? Gorsuch talks about other contextual clues. He looks for treasury notices, IRS fact sheets, letter to Boyd that was sent to her to apprise her of the statute. And in that letter, he finds language that says, for failure to file the F-bar, the penalty cannot exceed $10,000. All of that he points to as indicia from other pieces of law that suggest the penalty is a per form penalty, not a per account penalty. Barrett says, well, I'm looking at implementing regulations, and they distinguish between the form used to report accounts and the report itself. A person who fails to report multiple foreign accounts on a single form violates the act multiple times, not just once. And there's some back and forth that gets a little bit sharper between the majority opinion and the dissent in this area. And it's not surprising because both of them are legitimately looking at other pieces of the law and finding support for their position that clashes with the other. This is Justice Barrett. I'm surprised that the court is moved by this administrative guidance. For one thing, even Bittner concedes that the materials do not speak directly to the questions presented in this case, whether additional penalties may accrue when a person fails to report multiple accounts. And Justice Gorsuch, in a footnote, responds by saying, well, the dissent founders on the same shoals. The dissent expresses surprise that we cite the government's guidance documents. We don't see why. Our point is not that the administrative guidance is controlling, nor is it that the government's guidance documents have consistently endorsed Mr. Bittner's reading of the law. It is simply that when the government or any litigant speaks out of both sides of its mouth, no one should be surprised if its latest utterance isn't the most convincing one. You may find yourself in opinions, either because you disagree with the majority opinion or the dissent does, saying to yourself, yeah, there's some legitimate room here for analytical decision-making that comes to different results. That's giving you some guidance about what you want to focus on and highlight in your analysis. And here, as the two different positions that articulated in the majority and dissent move further beyond the language of the statute, things get even a little bit more murky. The purpose of the statute, Justice Barrett in her dissent says, when analyzing the complex webs of money laundering or funding for international terrorism, knowing about every account matters. Well, right, the purpose of this statute is first and foremost to make sure that money is not being laundered for criminal purposes or to underwrite terrorist activities. The idea that every account is important to know about makes a lot of sense. Justice Gorsuch comes back with a point on practicality. So is it your position, government, that a person who has a $1 million account and willfully fails to report it gets a $100,000 fine as set out by the statute for a willful violation, but a person who non-willfully fails to list 20 accounts with an aggregate balance far smaller than that of $50,000, for example, somehow gets a $200,000 fine? That doesn't make practical sense. And beyond that, Justice Gorsuch, joined only by Justice Jackson, moves to the point of lenity. There's no fair warning to the world in this governmental reading of the statute, Justice Gorsuch says. A number of the government's own public guidance documents have seemingly warned of per report, not per account penalties for non-willful violation. The government hasn't expressed itself in a way that gives a fair warning to people that commit non-willful violations about what the possible penalties are. Well, all that stuff ultimately results in a requirement that you make a conclusion about the case that you'll be writing about. What does this case add to the law? If there's a majority opinion and a dissenting opinion, which carries the day by your lights? You might say to yourself, these are Supreme Court justices, state Supreme Court justices or state Court of Appeals justices, federal Court of Appeals judges. Who am I to talk about this? Well, you're the person who's writing the case note. And ultimately, you're supposed to come to some kind of conclusion about the importance of this case, whether it was correctly decided or not, how it adds to the law, how it moves the law, how it changes the law. It doesn't need to be earth-shattering, but it does need to be useful. And that's your job with respect to each of these 5 parts of the case note. So let's talk a little bit about what I would do if, having gone through all of this discussion about the case and having read this case, how I would go about writing the case note itself. The critical first step is an obvious one, and it's to read the case. And it takes some time doing it. I've been reading cases since I was in law school, and this year I celebrate my 40th anniversary of graduation. I read dozens of cases all the time. I've gotten pretty good at it. I've gotten pretty used to it. But when I got ready to talk with you about this case, I sat down and I read it word for word very carefully so that I could be an accurate reporter to the best of my ability about this case. And you now will have read at least hundreds of cases by this point in your legal career. My first piece of advice is slow down. Look at it carefully and recognize you're going to need to report on this. So it's worthwhile to take some time. And once you've read the case, the advice that I'm going to give you may seem painful or redundant, but step 2 is read it again. And here's why. Even though you've read a lot of cases, as you read through this, no matter how careful you are, there's going to be a progression of information that is revealed to you. By the time you get to the end of the case, you're going to know more than you did when you began reading the case. And that knowledge is the knowledge you want to take to your second reading. Every single piece of the case is going to make more sense to you once you read the case a second time. Is it tedious? Well, it can be. I was blessed with a case that had 2 pretty snappy writers to read, so I was able to move through it without losing interest at any point. But even I found that phenomenon happening again, as it always does. Any case I want to think about, any case I want to write about, I read at least twice, because I will have learned more about the case and more about how the arguments and analysis of the case are structured as I've read through it. And I want to take that knowledge back and read the case again, because I'm going to start seeing things in that second reading that I didn't see before. After you've read the case once or twice, or maybe 3 times, you can go from there. And the place that I would advise you to go is not to other cases, not to the library, but straight to writing. This is the point in time to write a draft case description. This was very hard for me as a writer. I like to assemble all the information that I'm going to need, and all the information I think I might need, and then some other information that I might want to have before I ever start writing at all. And that tended to be the way I wrote as an undergraduate, and it tended to be the way I wrote at first as a law student. It's not the way I write anymore. If I'm going to write about something, if I'm going to write about a case, I like to get started early, because just as a second reading always adds something to my understanding, it turns out that forcing myself to write about the case, even if the description that I'm writing is relatively straightforward and isn't going to be in service of something as well developed as a case note, even if it's just going to be a description of the case that I'm going to add, for example, to a treatise, I've found that the discipline of writing about the case next sends me back to the language of the case. And even though I may think, having read the case twice or maybe even 3 times, I know it pretty well, when I'm forced to write about it and forced to describe it, I'm going to end up going back to that case and learning a little bit more about it. And so I encourage you to begin your exploration of this case with those 3 simple steps. Read it once, read it at least twice, and then start writing about it, because you're going to understand the case and know it better if you do that. And then start writing a little bit about its history so that you understand it. And you do that so that you can write a preliminary conclusion. Now, you may say to yourself, hold on a second. I'm not ready to write a conclusion. I need to go back. I need to do some more research. I need to read the cases. I need to read that Fifth Circuit and Ninth Circuit opinion so that I can have better understanding and better command of the history. And until I do that, and probably until I read some of the cases that are in those other cases, I'm not ready to write a conclusion. And here I will tell you something that a mentor of mine told me that I think is enormously helpful. You're going to have a better understanding of your road forward if you know where it leads. You're going to have a better understanding of what more research you need to do if you have an idea about what your conclusion is. That doesn't mean you're locked into that conclusion. You may read something that changes your mind and sends you back to the case description and the history and that initial draft of your conclusion to do some rewriting, because you're going to tweak it or change it altogether, and that's fine. But the additional research and additional writing you do is going to be in service of a conclusion. And that is going to keep you better focused. And at that point, you can go back to your case description, even if the conclusion that you've come to turns out to be the one that you keep the entire time. You can rewrite that case description, because I guarantee that you're going to find some things that you want to expand on, some things that you can trim, because you're now going to look at that case description in service of the conclusion to your argument. And at that point, you can start more of your analysis in a serious way. There is a real temptation whenever you're doing this work to believe that you need to know everything before you can write anything. And I feel that temptation. It would be very hard for me to write even a preliminary conclusion. I'm not sure who I agree with. Still, I don't. Justice Barrett seemed to have some really good arguments in her dissent. Justice Gorsuch certainly made his case very strongly. The point on lenity, that there doesn't seem to be any warning to people, that really resonates with me. But I'm not sure who I agree with. But I am sure that if I were going to write about this case in a way that would be appropriate for a case note, I would want to have at least a working conclusion in mind before I got to more in-depth analysis, and before I went back to read that Fifth Circuit opinion, that Ninth Circuit opinion, to look at other parts of the statute that aren't mentioned in either of the opinions, to read whatever precedent the Fifth Circuit and Ninth Circuit found so that they could come to the conclusion that they did. Why? Because there are a lot of cases out there. And the temptation to read every case that is cited in the case you're writing about, and then every case that is cited in the cases that are cited in the case that you're writing about, is a real and present danger, because it is a danger that will keep you reading and distract you from writing. Think about this as a process of creating multiple drafts, and be willing to start the writing early with a draft that is probably going to be largely rewritten and mostly discarded before it ever is completed. One of my favorite pieces of advice about writing doesn't come from Brian Garner. Brian Garner's wonderful. Doesn't come from any legal textbook. It comes from a writer named Annie Lamott, and she wrote a book called Bird by Bird. And it is a book about writing fiction. And it is a book that is designed to help people that want to write fiction start writing fiction. And her first piece of advice is to write, and I apologize for the language, my mother would be appalled. She said, you've got to get used to writing shitty first drafts. And her point is this: the writing has to start somewhere, and it'll start somewhere short of perfection, and indeed somewhere short of what you hope for, but it needs to start. And the same thing is true for legal writing. Yes, your analysis and research aren't complete. Yes, you're just beginning. But the best place to begin is with some writing, which is why I strongly encourage you to think about doing that initial draft of a case description, a little bit of history so that you better understand the context of the case, and a conclusion that is your working conclusion for what it is that you want to say about this case. And then, after you've done this process, circle back through and think about your conclusion, your case description, your analysis, and continue refining it. And only when you really feel like you have got something that is pretty good description of the case with a solid conclusion that you think is supported by good analysis, would I bother to write an introduction. When I was a newer writer and a dumber writer, before I got to be a more experienced writer, and frankly, a lazier writer in some ways, I would have started the case note when I was first in law school by writing the introduction first. Think how hard that is. You don't even know what the case note is going to be about or what your conclusion is. When I became a little bit more adept, a little bit wiser, and figured out ways to do a little bit less work, I wrote my introduction last. And I still remember turning in some paper in law school, having written the introduction last, and getting a comment back that said, this introduction really does a good job summarizing what your paper is about and introducing the reader to the conclusion. And I thought to myself, why should anyone be surprised about that? I wrote it last. Of course, it's going to do a good job with that. But I also realized that there were a lot of people that weren't doing that. They were simply writing straight through with an idea and a hope about what their conclusion was going to be. I'd written a couple drafts of my conclusion before I ever read the introduction. One of the things that I can promise you is that if you take this approach to writing the case note and begin your writing early, you're going to avoid some of the biggest traps that happen that result in people investing a lot of effort in the case note with not a lot to show about it by the time it needs to be turned in. The two big pitfalls, I think, are first, I've read through the case and I just don't know where to begin. And so I don't begin writing. What I begin with is more research. I read through the statutes that are mentioned. And then I decide I'm going to do some research about other cases that have interpreted those statutes that aren't this case or necessarily this interpretation, but might guide me about it. And you end up feeling as if you're engaged in productive labor. Well, you're certainly working. You're reading cases, you're researching, but it's not work that is meant to produce a case note. So school yourself to the extent you need to do a little bit of writing and then start the writing process. The best case notes are ones that have been through multiple drafts. And that can only happen if you start your writing early in the process. So do. And let the additional research and work you do lead you to revision and second drafts of that case note. Yes, you may not know where to begin, but simply because you don't doesn't mean you can't begin. If you begin with a case description, well, yeah, you can do that. You know where to begin with that because you've read the case at least twice. You're ready to write a description. The second thing I think that happens is that causes problems for people and leads to weaker case notes than they would hope for, is they write a lot about the case. Yeah, my description is great. Boy, I've written pages about the legal history that leads up to this opinion. I've even sort of recapitulated the analysis that's in the case, but I haven't spent much time writing about what this case means or why it's important or why the opinion makes sense or why it doesn't, or how this case has changed the law, or whether it's done so in a good way or bad way. You don't need to have a conclusion that is earth-shattering, but as I said, it should be useful and provide some guidance about what's important about this case. You don't want to spend hours researching the case, reading the case, writing about the case and describing the case, and end up with a conclusion that sounds something like, in the end, courts decide cases, and this is one of them. You want something more tangible and meaningful than that. And the best way to do that is to make sure that early on in the process, you are bold enough to venture some conclusion about why this case is important, why this opinion works, or why this opinion doesn't. Even if you end up changing your mind, the work that you do from then on is going to be stronger because you've got an end in mind. And with an end in mind, it's easier to get where you're going. Well, that's what I've got to say about writing case notes. Stephen, I'll turn things back to you, let you field questions, and if I can help answer them, I'll certainly do so.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Knapp. Any questions from anybody? I didn't see any popping up into the chat. It's kind of, I know it's kind of a lot to take in all at one time, but it does get, it gets easier. One of the things, the more you sit with it, the more manageable it is. So if you feel overwhelmed, don't worry, it does get better.
Stephen, can I add something?
Absolutely.
So first, thank you so much for being here, Professor Knapp, and for providing this really great resource. I remember it was a huge help to me last year. I just wanted to add on, you had talked a lot about going back and doing extra research as you're going through, and I just wanted to clarify for everyone getting ready for Write On that you will have a closed universe, but that doesn't mean that you won't run into that still, because I think it's very possible you get the big packet, you skim a lot of things, and then as you get into your research, you might be like, oh, I did read that one other case that raised this, and you might return to things. So I think that's still really applicable to think about how much time you are returning to sources. But just know you'll be slightly kept from going down too deep a rabbit hole of additional research.
Carissa, I cannot remember for the life of me if we include a sample case note in the write-on materials. It's not a bad idea though. I actually we should do that even if we don't.
Yeah, I don't think we have, but I think that what I know some people did is you can look through the Mitchell-Hamline Law Review archives as well, and you can find any case note to serve as your example. I know that I did that and some other friends did, but we can also add that if you guys are open to doing that, Stephen.
Yeah, I think we can manage that. And then just a couple of details about the case note, or Write On in general. I know you guys have probably already heard about it. Just to reiterate, it'll start May 22nd and run until June 11th. There's a week for the Blue Book quiz, and then you have, if you complete the Blue Book quiz, you'll get the case note materials, and you'll have a 2-week window to do that case note. The big advice here, yeah, don't procrastinate. A lot of people are going to turn it in really close to the deadline. I believe mine came in or went in at 11:58 p.m. Just right under the wire. It still counts, but if you can avoid doing that to yourself, I would avoid it. The case note, it's minimum of 8 pages of text, 8 pages of footnote endnotes, max of 20 pages total. It's double spaced. It's not bad. It can sound like a lot at one time, but if you really go through the process that Professor Knapp laid out, it breaks it down really easy. It's step by step, and you're able to fill in, like, the length is not a concern. Like, you will, if you don't know this already in law school, length is really not, it's not that hard usually a lot of times to hit the minimum word count. I've always been the one that had to cut way down. I had some where, it was 2,000 word count limit, and I had to cut half of mine. It's bad. But yeah, don't be overwhelmed. It's a lot more manageable than it sounds. We actually, just personal story, my wife and I, we had our third baby a week after capstone last year. So I did Write On with a newborn, and still it's manageable. It's not that scary. It'll be all right, and it's absolutely worth it. So yeah, like, I mean, I worked full time, at the time it was two kids and then a newborn. And then, full in law school. So you can do it. Don't be scared. You'll never not succeed if you try. I mean, you don't lose anything by trying, is really what I'm trying to get at. So if you can't get in if you don't try, that's the only thing. So put it out there, see what happens. And I can hang out longer if you guys have any questions about Write On. Put information for registering for the law Write On, the info page for the Write On at the Mitchell-Hamline Law Review. It's all there for you. It's all in the chat, sorry. Professor Knapp, I think this is a question for you. What's the ultimate tone of our analysis, more objective versus more persuasive?
I think a little bit of that depends on your conclusion, but in general, you want to be reporting on the case in an even-handed way, even if you think that it's moved the law in a direction. And that even-handedness should influence the tone of the analysis as well.
And Laura asked if we don't get in, do we get input as to what to improve on? I don't think we've given feedback in the past. Like it's a lot to give the feedback on to everyone directly. That's it. If you really want to know, if you reach out to send an email to MHSL submissions@gmail. After you're done, if you don't get in, just send us an email and we'll do our best to get you some feedback there. I can't promise it'll be particularly quick because that's a busy time going through everyone's information, but we'll get some feedback to you if we can. All right, any other questions, anybody?
Well, thank you so much for your time, and I wish you all good luck.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Knapp, and we'll post the
Thank you so
recording
much.
to our to the Mitchell-Hamline Law Review website as well.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.